What do you do when the people you trust the most cross a line you never saw coming? How far would family loyalty go if trust were betrayed? Family gatherings were always the same, yet somehow different each time, a kind of rhythm to them that felt as reliable as the seasons. This particular one took place in the heart of summer, under a sun so warm it seemed to soften everything it touched. The smell of charred meat drifted lazily through the yard, mingling with the sweet scent of freshly cut grass and blooming lilies from my aunt's garden. Laughter bubbled up from little pockets of family, as easy and abundant as the ice clinking in our glasses. Conversations overlapped, merging in a low hum, each voice familiar, each laugh a reminder of why these moments mattered so much. I remember that day vividly. My nephew Cyrus, always the center of attention, was there, of course. He moved through the crowd with the kind of confidence you couldn't fake, his smile wide, his arms open, as if the whole world was welcome in his orbit. He had this charm, this effortless way of putting people at ease that only someone in their early 20s seems to have. He was like a younger brother to me, a soul I'd watched grow, taught, and even protected through the years. I'd known him since he was small, and in some ways, I felt more like a mother than an aunt. But there was someone else there that day too, his friend Declan. Declan wasn't quite part of the family, not in the way Cyrus was, not even in the way family friends sometimes become over time. He was polite, quiet, standing a few paces back from the crowd like he wasn't entirely sure of his place. He had a face that was hard to read, with eyes that seemed to drift just above the heads of everyone else, like he was searching for something, or maybe waiting for something I couldn't see. Every so often, I'd catch him watching us from the edges of the yard, his expression steady, reserved, never quite engaging. At first, I brushed it off. Declan was just shy, I told myself. Just the kind of young man who wasn't used to this kind of loud, chaotic warmth that families like ours so freely shared. I knew people like that, quiet, introspective, content to let the noise of others fill the space around them. But there was something else too. A subtle distance in the way he carried himself, the way his hands stayed buried in his pockets or clasped behind his back. He never laughed too loud, never raised his voice. Even his smile seemed hesitant, the kind that faded the moment he thought no one was looking. And yet, despite the quiet restraint that set him apart, Declan was never far from Cyrus. It was as if there was an invisible thread that kept them tethered, drawing Declan back into the center of things each time he drifted too far. I remember wondering how they'd become friends. What connected Cyrus, so vibrant and carefree, with someone like Declan? I thought of asking him once or twice, but the moment would pass, and I'd move on to another conversation, another glass of iced tea, another round of laughter. As the evening wore on, the sun began to dip lower, casting a golden glow across the yard. Children darted between the tables, their shrieks of joy echoing into the air. My father stood by the grill, flipping burgers, wearing that old apron he'd had since I was a child, the one with the faded lettering that read, "Kiss the cook." My mother was there too, passing around plates, her voice a steady rhythm of gentle reminders, making sure everyone had enough to eat. It was the kind of evening that wrapped around you like a favorite old sweater, comforting and familiar. But even as I settled into the easy lull of the gathering, my eyes kept drifting back to Declan. I don't know why. There was no single moment that stood out, no reason I could point to. Just small things, I suppose. The way he would glance around, watching the others, his gaze catching for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. The way he positioned himself, always on the outskirts, never fully joining in. There was a brief moment when I saw him standing just a few feet from the kids as they played, his expression blank, his eyes focused. He wasn't smiling, just observing. When he noticed me watching him, he shifted, turning his attention back to the adults, as if he'd been caught somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It was just a passing thought, a flicker of awareness that came and went like the breeze. He was just a friend of Cyrus's, I reminded myself, probably uncomfortable with all the noise and closeness that came with being in our family's space. But a part of me, some small corner of my mind, kept that image of Declan in the back of my memory, The way he had looked at us, and how, for just a second, it seemed like he was seeing something different than the rest of us. By the time the stars began to peek through the fading light, Declan had drifted to the far side of the yard again, leaning against the fence, arms crossed over his chest. Cyrus was with him, talking animatedly, gesturing with his hands, his laughter carrying through the warm summer air. And Declan was listening, nodding along, but with that same distant look. I tried to brush off the unease, telling myself it was nothing, that Declan was simply a quiet young man who felt out of place. But I couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking, standing there on the edge of it all, looking in. The night had wrapped around us like a blanket, a quiet reminder that the evening was coming to a close. I remember standing in the cool night air, watching the last of the family drift into cars, laughter still ringing in my ears, my heart full in that way only a long day with loved ones can leave you. As I was gathering my things, Cyrus and Declan approached, offering to drive me home. It seemed so natural. Cyrus was family, someone I trusted implicitly, and Declan, well, he was with Cyrus. I barely gave it a second thought, reassured by the presence of someone I'd known and loved all his life. As we climbed into the car, I remember feeling a surge of relief at not having to drive myself, grateful for the company after a long day. But as we started down the quiet roads, I couldn't ignore a faint shift in the air. Maybe it was Declan's tone, or maybe it was the way conversation would fall silent now and then, leaving an odd weight in the pauses. I tried to dismiss it as my own exhaustion, brushing off any notion of unease. I told myself it was just the stillness of the night, the effect of darkness closing in around us as the car moved along the empty streets. Yet, a strange feeling lingered. I kept trying to push it away, reminding myself that Cyrus was beside me. We'd shared so many moments of trust over the years. He was the child I'd practically raised, the young man I'd watched grow, my nephew who'd looked up to me. So I told myself I was safe. He was family after all. But as we drove on, I couldn't shake a creeping awareness, an unease building slowly in the quiet between us. Every time the road stretched on in silence, every glance at Declan's unreadable expression, it was like a whisper at the back of my mind that wouldn't go away, no matter how I tried to convince myself otherwise. At first, it was nothing. A glance here, a glance there. Declan's gaze meeting Cyrus's in the rearview mirror just for a second, then flicking away like nothing happened. But once I started noticing, I couldn't stop. There was something about those glances, silent exchanges that held a strange intensity, a message only they understood. It was subtle, barely there, but the kind of silence that changes a room, that pulls everything tight and makes even the air feel different. I shifted in my seat, feeling the upholstery press against my back. The faint scent of cologne lingered, almost too strong in the stale, warm air of the car. Every sound felt amplified in that small space. The soft hum of the engine, the shuffle of a foot shifting on the pedal, the creak of a leather seat. Cyrus's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale under the streetlights that passed in fleeting bursts. His posture was tense, different from the easy confidence I knew so well. Declan sat motionless, his face half hidden in shadow. His expression turned inward, unreadable. I tried to brush it off as nothing, but every detail seemed to scratch at the back of my mind, like a piece of a puzzle I didn't have all the pieces for yet. And then, Cyrus spoke. Just a passing comment, his voice low, steady, like he was talking to himself more than me. He said something about loyalty, about how family sticks together, no matter what. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror as he said it, a look that felt longer than it should have been. I let it slide, brushed it off as nothing. But there was something in his tone, in the way his words lingered in the air, that left me uneasy. I found myself wondering if there was something I wasn't seeing, a context I wasn't privy to. To fill the silence, I tried to make small talk, asked how their evening had been, if they'd had as much fun as I had. But the replies were short, almost clipped. Cyrus nodded but didn't say much, his attention fixed on the road. Declan's responses when they came were barely more than monosyllables. The lightheartedness that had filled the evening had vanished, replaced by a kind of heaviness, a tension that sat like a weight in the back of my throat. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that it was just the quiet of the night. But the silence felt charged, each minute stretching out longer than the one before. And in that car, something had shifted, something I couldn't put a name to yet, but felt pressing down all the same. It started with small comments, things I might have laughed off on another day. But that night, every word felt off-kilter. Cyrus began talking, his voice low, almost casual, about how people sometimes hid things. Family, he said, was built on trust. But it only took one betrayal to change everything. I glanced at him, tried to catch his eye in the rearview mirror, but he kept his gaze fixed on the road, expression unreadable, as if he was talking to someone else entirely. Something shifted in me then, a slight unease that grew sharper with each word. I looked to Declan, searching for some reassurance, a hint that this was just another one of Cyrus's mind games. But Declan sat quietly, eyes forward, his face cast in shadow. He seemed miles away, detached, like he didn't want to be part of whatever was unfolding here. Yet somehow, his silence only added to the sense that something was very wrong. My mind raced, grasping for any logical reason for their behavior, trying to piece together any missteps I might have made that would explain this sudden coldness. But nothing made sense, and the gnawing sense of dread started creeping in, tugging at my every thought. I could hear my own breath, shallow and tight, as I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself it was all in my head, that Cyrus was just being Cyrus. As the car rolled down the deserted street, Adrienne could feel the tension in the air, thick and electric, the soft hum of the engine, the distant glow of streetlights flickering as they passed. It all seemed to fade into the background as the moments stretched on. The silence was unbearable now, and Adrienne could sense that something was about to be said. Cyrus's voice broke the stillness, low and hesitant. "Aunt Adrienne, there's something I've been meaning to tell you." Adrienne's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head slightly, unsure of where this was going. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale under the streetlights, but his eyes never left the road. She could feel a weight in his tone, something serious, something out of the ordinary. "I've been thinking about it a lot, actually," he continued, his voice quieter now. "About us, about how things have been between us over the years." Adrienne frowned, the words not quite making sense. "Cyrus, what are you talking about?" I don't know how to say this, but I think you might feel the same way I do. I think you've known, deep down." His voice shook ever so slightly, betraying the calm front he was trying to maintain. "I've never said anything because of how complicated it would be. But it's not something I can just ignore anymore." Adrienne's pulse quickened. Her mind raced to process what Cyrus was implying. But before she could form a response, Declan, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Cyrus is right," he said softly, his voice unusually steady. "It's not just him. We've both felt this way. For a while now." Adrienne's chest tightened. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Wait, what? What do you mean?" "I mean," Cyrus began, his voice barely above a whisper, "that we both care about you. More than just family. It's not something I've ever said out loud, but it's there. And I think you felt it too." Adrienne felt the car suddenly grow colder, the world outside losing its clarity as she struggled to comprehend what they were saying. She wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but her throat felt tight, as though the words were stuck. Declan's expression was unreadable, but his eyes locked onto hers in the rearview mirror, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something that unsettled her even more. "It's been building up for a long time," he said softly, his words carrying a weight of truth that struck Adrienne like a physical blow. "But we couldn't let it go on anymore without telling you." Adrienne's mind was reeling. The air in the car was thick, suffocating. Every part of her wanted to deny what they were saying, to push back, but the sincerity in their eyes, The way their voices trembled told her that they were serious, and something in her, something buried deep inside, told her that this revelation had always been hovering in the background, never fully acknowledged, until now. I don't know what to say, Adrienne whispered, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the seat. This isn't what I expected. I didn't know. Cyrus's gaze softened, a strange sadness behind his eyes. I know, Aunt Adrienne. I know it's a lot to take in, but we just needed you to know. You're everything to us. You always have been. The weight of the moment settled heavily on Adrienne's chest. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, clouding her thoughts. She had always seen them as family, always trusted them, loved them. But now, with their confessions in the car, she didn't know what to believe anymore. There was no easy way to process what they had just revealed. She looked out of the window, trying to collect her thoughts, trying to steady her breath. I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what to say. Everything's changed. There was a long silence, punctuated only by the sound of the tires on the asphalt. Cyrus didn't push her. He simply nodded, as if he had expected her reaction, though it didn't make it any easier. Declan's hand, resting on the armrest between them, twitched slightly, but he remained silent. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Cyrus broke the silence again. You don't have to decide anything right now, Aunt Adrienne. We just wanted you to know. And we'll be here, no matter what. We'll always be here. The car slowed as they approached Adrienne's house. The streetlights outside seemed to flicker, casting long shadows that stretched across the driveway. Adrienne didn't move, couldn't move. The weight of their confessions pressed down on her like a heavy blanket, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had just occurred. She glanced at them one last time, her mind still swirling with confusion. The bond she had once felt so sure of now felt fractured, undefined. She didn't know how to process their words, or how this would change everything moving forward. Thank you for telling me, Adrienne said, her voice barely a whisper. But I need time. I just need time. Cyrus and Declan exchanged a look, their faces softened with understanding. They didn't say anything more. The car came to a stop, and the silence that followed seemed louder than ever. Adrienne opened the door slowly, her legs unsteady as she stepped out. The cool night air hit her face, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside her. She glanced back at the car one last time before stepping toward her front door. She didn't know what the future held, or how things would ever be the same again. But as the car drove away, she could feel the weight of their confessions lingering in the air, a shadow that would follow her for as long as she could remember.